Everyone knows Joseph Stalin, or at least has heard of him. Stalin is mentioned in the same breath as Hitler when it comes to dictators. Far left and far right, perfectly balanced. From 1928 to 1953, he was the leader of the Soviet Union, and he ruled with an iron fist. Living in Stalin's Soviet Union must have been no picnic. Famines ravaged the country several times during his reign. The Holodomor famine in Ukraine, for example, claimed between 2.5 and 7.5 million lives. Stalin's policies were the cause of this disaster. Ukrainian farms were consolidated to free up more labor for industrialization. Ukraine wasn't the only region plagued by food shortages, but some historians accuse the Soviet Union of malice. According to these historians, the Soviet Union deliberately caused a famine in Ukraine to weaken the country's sense of independence. In large parts of Europe, North America, and South America, the Holodomor is recognized as a genocide. Even if you did have access to enough food, you could still be arrested by the Soviet secret police. The NKVD destroyed anyone who posed a threat to Stalin's power. During the Great Purge from 1934 to 1936, the NKVD reportedly exterminated 2 million people. No one was safe, not even Stalin's friends. The dictator was a deeply paranoid man. Hundreds of books have been written and thousands of videos made about these aspects of Stalin's life. Simon Montefiore, for example, wrote a 752-page masterpiece about Stalin. But what about Stalin's early years? Can Stalin's paranoid and cruel nature be traced back to the roots of his life? We'll find out together.
Ever wondered which choices and twists of fate shaped the world as we know it? Stories that began as whispers, only to rise into legends echoed across the globe? Step with us into the shadows of the past. We need history.
Violence and education. Stalin was born on the 18th of December 1878 in Gori, a small, poor town in central Georgia with a population of 7,000 at the time. Many of the townspeople lived in mud houses, and the streets were the strips of sand where no weeds grew. At the time, Gori was part of the Russian Empire. Stalin was therefore not born Russian, as some might have thought, but as a Georgian, an identity he would remain proud of throughout his life. His birth name was Ioseb Stalin, but his parents often called him by his pet name, So-So. The name Stalin didn't even exist in 1878. Later in this video, you'll find out when and how Ioseb chose this name, but for simplicity's sake, I'll continue to call him Stalin instead of Ioseb Stalin. Stalin's birthplace was later enclosed by an immense temple with marble columns and stands near the Stalin Museum, which you can still visit in Georgia today. Stalin did not grow up in a happy family. He was the third child of his father, Bessarion Yugishvili, and his mother, Ekaterine Gelatz. But Joseph was the only one of the three to survive his childhood. After the death of her first two children, Ekaterine was distraught. She turned to God and, during her third pregnancy, vowed to make a pilgrimage to Gary if the third child survived. God and Ekaterine both kept their promise. Had this not happened, history would have taken a very different course. Stalin's father, Bessarion, was violent towards his family. As a toddler, Stalin once went to the neighbors, yelling and screaming that his father was murdering his mother. Bessarion nearly strangled Ekaterine. Father Stalin had become addicted to alcohol after his first children died young. Rumors also circulated that his wife, Ekaterine, had been unfaithful, but these rumors were never confirmed. Historians consider it possible that Stalin was actually the son of his godfather, Kobe Ignashvili, a wealthy innkeeper. However, it is known that Ekaterine didn't let herself be beaten up easily. She fought fiercely back against her husband. Reportedly, he once throwing a dagger at him. Bessarion was a shoemaker by trade and had his own shop in Gori. Initially, the shop was successful, at one point employing more than 10 people. But his alcohol addiction threw a wrench in the works. The villagers nicknamed him Crazy Besso. What certainly didn't help was that some customers paid off their debts in wine, a common practice in Georgia at the time. Bessarion left the family when Stalin was only 6 years old. He returned to Tbilisi and began working in a factory. Afterward, Bessarion had little contact with his family, except for one incident. Stalin's father died in 1909 of cirrhosis, a liver disease often caused by alcohol abuse. Only one photograph of him has been preserved, but historians disagree as to whether it is actually of Bessarion. Stalin's mother, Ekaterine, also known as Keke, married the 22 or 24-year-old Bessarion when she was 16. Initially, Ekaterine was very happy with her husband. The young Georgian was an eligible bachelor. According to Keke's memoirs, all her friends were jealous of her. Ah, young love is sweet love. However, her 2 deceased children and her abusive husband made her life a living hell. Fortunately, Keke was able to draw inspiration from her son, Stalin. Ekaterine wanted her son to become a priest. Stalin's mother was herself very religious. Stalin regularly attended mass with his mother, and it was through the priest's sons that Stalin learned Russian. After her husband's departure and the loss of their home, mother and son moved from address to address until they found a permanent apartment in 1886. Ekaterine worked as a seamstress to pay for her son's education. According to his peers, Stalin was very much like his mother in character. Both were disciplined, intelligent, and persistent. Kiki continued to live in small Gori until Stalin became leader of the Soviet Union. Then she left her small village for Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. After Stalin's reign, mother and son rarely saw each other in person. They did, however, maintain contact through letters. Kiki last saw her son in 1935. According to her doctor's memoirs, Stalin and Kiki had the following conversation during their last meeting. "Mama, do you remember our Tsar? Well, I'm something like the Tsar." To which his mother replied, "You'd have done better to become a priest." Stalin then asked, "Why did you dream so much of me becoming a priest?" And Kiki concluded, "I saw how little they worked and how well they lived. They were also greatly respected. So I thought there was no better occupation for a man, and I would have been proud that I was a priest's mother. But I confess, even about that, I was wrong." In 1937, Kiki died, and, on Stalin's orders, was buried in the Metzeminda Pantheon. Only the most famous Georgians were buried in this temple. But her son, busy massacring his political enemies in the Great Purge, did not attend her funeral. On the one hand, this demonstrates the respect Stalin had for his mother. On the other, it shows that Stalin placed his power above everything and everyone, even his own family. Back in 1888, Stalin started attending the Gori Church school at his mother's command and with his mother's support. The school was originally intended solely for the sons of clergymen. However, Kiki, thanks to her strong connections in the church, managed to secure a place for Ioseb. However, Stalin's father, who had by then divorced his mother, was not happy about this. He wanted his son to become a shoemaker, to continue the family tradition. In January 1890, Bessarion had the opportunity to free his son from his mother's influence. 12-year-old Stalin was seriously injured when a carriage struck him. Bessarion returned to Gori, kidnapped his son, and took him to a hospital in Tiflis. Stalin recovered from most of his injuries, although he was left with a lifelong disability in his left arm from the accident. And he began working as an apprentice at the factory where Bessarion worked. Historians like to view this as the dramatic moment when Stalin first encountered capitalism. But whether this experience as an intern was such a life-changing moment for Stalin, we don't know. Keke was naturally furious and used her contacts within the church again, this time to bring Stalin home. Stalin continued his studies and cleaned the school to cover his education costs. Fortunately, his academic performance was so good that he was awarded a scholarship. But don't be fooled. Stalin was far from a model student. As a youngster, Stalin was in a sort of youth gang with his friends. Fights regularly broke out between these gangs. Stalin is also said to have once fired ammunition from a firearm in a local shop. This could be legend though. Stalin wasn't exactly a sweetheart, but he was quite clever. In 1894, Stalin graduated. On his mother's orders, he registered for the entrance exams at the Tbilisi Theological Seminary. Stalin passed and was admitted. Commuting between Gori and Tbilisi every day proved impossible, so Stalin went to boarding school, where he slept in large rooms that held 30 people. All of this cost his mother a considerable sum. She likely received help from her friends and the church community. The young Georgian suddenly found himself in a completely different environment. At the seminary, the priests watched him 24/7. This was a stark contrast to the freedom he had experienced in Gori. Partly due to the new environment, Stalin lost interest in his studies. His grades plummeted and he began to misbehave. In rebellion, he grew his hair long, arrived late to meals, proclaimed himself an atheist, and participated in a banned book club. Georgian books were forbidden at the seminary. Said Davidirani, his roommate, introduced him to the secret club. Members read forbidden books under their sheets at night by candlelight, hoping to remain invisible to the priests. In this club, Stalin read 3 books that influenced the course of his life. First, What is to be Done by Nikolan Chernyshevsky. The story concerns a woman who escapes her controlling family and forced marriage to be free. The book contains pro-revolutionary and socialist elements. Second, The Patricide by Alexander Kazbegi, a romance novel that is highly critical of the socio-economic situation in Georgia in the 19th century. Incidentally, Stalin borrowed his nickname from the book's main character, Koba. According to Eramashvili, a fellow member of the club, Stalin insisted that they call him Koba and beamed when his friends actually used the name. The final book was Das Kapital by Karl Marx, perhaps the most famous of the bunch. Das Kapital is an exposition of Karl Marx's socio-economic ideas. These ideas were compiled and called Marxism. In short, Marxism is based on the idea that society consists of 2 groups, the owning class and the working class. According to Marx, this class struggle would end with the revolution of the working class against the owning class. And after reading Das Kapital, Stalin began attending secret Marxist meetings. Along with Eramishvili, Ioseb would sneak out of the boarding school in the evenings to attend these meetings. One day, Stalin simply decided to not return to boarding school. He later claimed that the school had expelled him for his revolutionary ideas, but this was merely boasting to his comrades. Stalin takes action. Stalin may have read Das Kapital, but he was still far from the revolutionary he would eventually become. For example, Ioseb had no contacts within the Russian Marxist parties. So he initially decided to tutor to make ends meet. Soon after, Stalin began working as a meteorologist at the Tiflis Observatory. During the night shifts at the observatory, he could read to his heart's content. More importantly, Stalin developed his own Marxist following. He taught Russian, literature, and Marxism to a group of young people, including other refugees from the theological seminary. Shortly afterward, he was arrested for the first time. According to the authorities, they arrested Stalin because his father hadn't paid taxes, and the police held Stalin responsible for this. But this was all complete fabrication. He was likely arrested as a warning, because Stalin was increasingly drifting into the revolutionary milieu. His mother and some friends paid taxes so that Stalin could be released. The warning had no effect on Stalin. He now organized his own secret meetings and persuaded many attendees to strike on the 1st of May. Stalin's impassioned public speech was decisive. The young revolutionary began to pose a threat to the state. His new activities brought him to the attention of the Russian secret police service, the Okhrana. The Okhrana was founded in 1866, specifically to combat the rise of left-wing revolutionary movements. The Okhrana employed double agents and executed tens of thousands of people at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. Later secret services, such as the NKVD, adopted many of the tricks of their predecessors. One day in March 1901, Stalin took the tram to work, as he often did. Suddenly, through the tram windows, he spotted a few not so well covered secret agents wandering around the building. Stalin tactfully stayed on the tram and only got off a few stops later. He realized the gravity of the situation. The secret police were looking for him. That couldn't be a good sign. So, with the support of his friends, he went into hiding. A year after organizing a strike on May 1st, Stalin was ready with another demonstration in Tiflis. 3,000 men stood face to face with the Russian defense forces. The protesters carried red flags emblazoned with the words "Down with tyranny." This public appearance put Stalin once again in the sights of the Okhrana. He was forced to go into hiding again, this time under the alias David. This also allowed Stalin to avoid military service. Because of his decisiveness, Stalin was elected to the committee of the Marxist Party RSDLP in Tiflis in November 1901. Not everyone was convinced of the young Georgian. His strategic insight and the ease with which he evaded the secret police led some fellow Marxists to doubt Stalin's intentions. Was he perhaps a double agent for the Okhrana? The Okhrana frequently spied on their enemies using double agents. Because of this, Stalin's opponents refused to admit him to the higher ranks. Perhaps they were jealous of the young Georgian's meteoric rise within the Marxist Party. At the same time, Stalin began working in a refinery. When it caught fire, the workers helped extinguish the building. The workers risked their own lives to save their workplace. Once the flames were extinguished, the helpers demanded a bonus for maintaining the factory. But the management refused. Consequently, Stalin, along with some other disgruntled workers, organized a strike. This was a resounding success, as the workers received a substantial pay rise. But a week later, 389 people were fired. Stalin again co-organized the strike. When several strike leaders were arrested, Stalin organized a third demonstration. Ioseb didn't give up. Along with the refinery workers, they stormed the prison where the leaders were being held. The outcome? 13 deaths, and Stalin himself was arrested in April 1902. One of the protesters had betrayed them and informed the prison about the demonstration. This allowed the Russian authorities to prepare for violence, and the protesters didn't stand a chance. Despite the 13 deaths, Stalin was euphoric. Today we advanced several years. We lost comrades, but we won, Stalin reportedly told another activist. Stalin was first sent to prison, but there he continued to incite his fellow inmates. Protests repeatedly erupted in the prisons where Stalin was held. His cellmates were impressed by Stalin's cool-headed nature. Each time, Ioseb emerged as a leader. Even in his cell, Stalin continued to read about politics and economics. He became a mentor to his fellow inmates, for example, reading the manifesto of the Communist Party to them. Just as he had done a few years earlier, Stalin started a book club. He also gave lectures on Marxism in prison. Stalin used his time in jail to teach others about Marxism. One prisoner later wrote that he found Stalin a very pleasant cellmate, despite the fact that he would later become a murderous dictator. The authorities grew tired of the Georgian and banished him to a small village in freezing Siberia. Novaya Uda consisted of a few shops, a church, a wooden fort to deter the local Mongols, and a slum for the poorer Russians. There, Stalin simply slept in a farmer's pantry. Just as he had in prison, he spent all his free time reading books, newspapers, magazines, and anything he could get his hands on. After 3 years, Stalin tired of the cold and tried to escape. His first attempt was a failure. After a long journey, his face began to freeze and he had to return to his exile village. But second time's the charm. Escaping from exile was far from impossible. The escapee needed only a small amount of pocket money to buy false papers, food, clothes, and train tickets. Stalin likely received the money from his fellow revolutionaries. So he returned to Tiflis. At first, his friends didn't recognize him because he had lost so much weight. There he became co-editor of the Marxist newspaper Proletariatis Brotzola, or Proletarian Struggle. This wasn't a legitimate job for Stalin, as the newspaper was printed illegally in 3 languages: Georgian, Armenian, and Russian. Lenin, the future leader of the Soviet Union, published several articles in the paper. During this period around 1904, between exiles, Stalin met his future and second wife, Nadia. The age difference at the time was considerable, even enormous. Nadia likely remembered nothing of the event. Stalin was 25, Nadia was 3. In 1917, Stalin and Nadia reconnected, and in 1919, when Nadia was 18 and Stalin 40, the couple married. The story can get even more absurd. Some historians are convinced that Stalin had an affair with Nadia's mother, Olga Fedorenko, in 1904. During his first exile, the RSDLP, the Marxist party to which Stalin belonged, had split into the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, and the Mensheviks, led by Julius Martov. Both parties were convinced that a revolution was necessary, but they differed on how to rebel. The Bolsheviks were more radical than the Mensheviks. Lenin and Stalin advocated the small elite professional party leadership. They believed in a small upper class that would govern on behalf of the working class. Julius Martov, on the other hand, wanted to create an open and inclusive party with the Mensheviks. Revolution and captivity. 1905 was a dark and turbulent year for the inhabitants of the Russian Empire. During a protest in St. Petersburg, people were shot by the Russian army. This event on January 22nd, 1905, is also known as Bloody Sunday. The protesters had prepared a petition for the Tsar to sign. They demanded better working conditions, higher wages, a limit on working hours to 8 hours per day, and universal suffrage. According to the Russian state, 96 people died. According to government opponents, more than 4,000. Modern historians estimate the number of wounded and dead at 1,000. Bloody Sunday is generally considered the start of the 1905 revolution. On the one hand, the revolution had major consequences for Russian politics, but on the other, very little. After the revolution, the first Russian parliament, the Duma, was established. But in reality, the Tsar, Nicholas II, retained all power. Back to Stalin. In 1905, he was in Azerbaijan, where a fierce conflict broke out between Armenians and Azeris. After hearing about the violence, Stalin formed several Bolshevik combat units to keep the two groups apart. They also took advantage of the chaos to raid local arsenals and extort money from local communities. All this to boost Bolshevik funds. Thanks to this decisiveness and opportunistic insights, Stalin was chosen as one of the Georgian Bolsheviks to attend the Congress in Finland. Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, was also scheduled to attend this Congress. Stalin had great respect for Lenin, but did not always agree with his ideas. For example, Lenin was eager to participate in the 1906 parliamentary elections. Stalin considered these elections a complete waste of time and wanted to seize power through a massive revolution. In other areas, the two agreed. For example, raising money for the Bolsheviks through robberies and extortion. In his private life, the next few years were a rollercoaster for Stalin. He fell in love with Kato Sfinze, married her in 1906, and together they had a son, Yakov, in 1907. Kato and Stalin were smitten, but Kato quickly learned that the revolution was Stalin's only true love. The Georgian was constantly organizing strikes, uprising, robberies, writing pamphlets, debating, and so on. Stalin neglected his family, and this proved fatal. Just 9 months after Yakov's birth, Kato died of typhus. Stalin was devastated. His friends confiscated his rival because they feared the widower would shoot himself in the head. Stalin reportedly said the following at Kato's funeral: "This creature softened my heart of stone. She died, and with her died my last warm feelings for humanity." Afterward, he threw himself on his wife's coffin. But what about their son? Stalin eventually left Yakov with Kato's family, fully aware that his life was too dangerous for his young son. In the early part of Yakov's life, he saw very little of his father. Perhaps Yakov reminded him of his lost love. At the same time, Stalin continued to organize robberies to fill the Bolsheviks' bank accounts. For example, in 1907, Stalin's combat units robbed a bank in Tiflis. During the robbery, carried out with homemade bombs, 40 people died. The thieves ultimately stole 250,000 rubles. Another way the group made a lot of money was by kidnapping the children of wealthy people and then demanding ransom. The rebels hid the money in bottles of Georgian wine and sent it to Bolshevik headquarters. There's an amusing anecdote about Kamo, the leader of the thieves. Years later, Kamo was arrested for all the crimes. To avoid the harshest sentences, his lawyer advised him to feign insanity. So, during the hearing, Kamo suddenly pulled a bird out of his sleeve and began asking for legal advice from the Finch. The thief was ultimately declared insane and imprisoned. Stalin too couldn't escape the police clutches. After a raid in Baku, he was arrested. Again, the judge sent him to prison. There, he had plenty of time and learned Esperanto. According to Stalin, this would be the language of the future. Ironically, decades later, after Stalin seized power in the Soviet Union, he would have these Esperanto speakers persecuted. A Jewish ophthalmologist created Esperanto in 1887 in Imperial Russia. The purpose of Esperanto was to allow people from different cultures to communicate with each other easily. After a few months in prison, Stalin was exiled to Solvygotsk. His residence was a very cozy little house, which he shared with 9 other exiles. Incidentally, in Solvygotsk, he was imprisoned by the local police for reading revolutionary literature. Stalin didn't like to sit still. Just as in his first imprisonment, he tried to escape. This time, Stalin disguised himself as a woman, and successfully so. A year later, however, he was arrested again in St. Petersburg and exiled to Solvygorsk. Again. In 1911, he received permission from the authorities to move to Vologda. Stalin held out there for a full 2 months before again, you guessed it, escaping. Stalin was clearly adept at escaping from small villages. As mentioned earlier, this wasn't necessarily difficult. With financial support from the Bolsheviks or your friends, you could easily return to civilization. But staying escaped was a different story. Stalin found it difficult to simply hide with his friends. He wanted to actively participate in the revolution, so he was arrested yet again. The Russian authorities learned absolutely nothing from the past and exiled him to Vologda again for 3 years. Now things are starting to get a little dull, but Stalin escaped again to St. Petersburg in February 1912. There he edited the weekly Zvezda, which he transformed into the daily Pravda. Stalin's role at the newspaper was a secret. The Bolsheviks feared Stalin would be arrested again. And rightly so, as Stalin was regularly exiled to some remote corner of Russia. Ultimately, Pravda would become the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Today, 2 newspapers still bear the name Pravda. One online version and one affiliated with the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. In 1912, Stalin published several articles arguing for the reconciliation between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Lenin was not in favor, so Stalin retracted his ideas. Stalin was indeed becoming increasingly powerful within the Bolshevik party, but when Lenin said no, it was no. Incidentally, it was during this period, around 1912, that Ioseb finally adopted the name Stalin. Stalin is derived from the Russian word for steel, stal. From that point on, he insisted that people call him Stalin, just as he had insisted in his youth that his friends call him Koba. In February 1913, Stalin was arrested and exiled for the 7th time in 9 years. This time in Turunsank in Siberia. The Russian authorities finally realized they couldn't simply send Stalin to the countryside. So, they moved him to Kureka, a village north of the Arctic Circle. In Kureka, according to some historians, Stalin allegedly entered into a relationship with 14-year-old Lydia Pereprigina. They had 2 children together, the first of whom died prematurely. The local authorities tried to force Stalin to marry Lydia, but this never happened. Ioseb showed no interest in his son or Lydia for the rest of his life. A somewhat more amusing anecdote from Kureka is that the locals believed Stalin had magical powers because he was such a skilled fisherman. Decades after the exile, a museum and pavilion were built in the village and around the wooden hut where Stalin lived during this exile. However, these were destroyed during the de-Stalinization of the 1960s. The end of the beginning. Stalin escaped exile again, but this time in a different way. All the exiled Bolsheviks were recruited into the Russian army in 1916 to fight in World War I. In 1917, the Bolshevik soldiers arrived in Krasnoyarsk, but there was one major problem for Stalin: his left arm. In 1890, the young Stalin was hit by a carriage, causing his left arm to malfunction. The army doctor declared him unfit for work. On the one hand, this was a relief for Stalin, as he thus avoided war. On the other, he was ashamed of his inability to fight for his country. Consequently, Stalin had to serve the remainder of his exile. He completed his term in Achinsk. During Stalin's stay in Achinsk, the February Revolution took place in St. Petersburg, then known as Petrograd. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, ultimately deposing Tsar Nicholas II and establishing the provisional government. This government was tasked with forming a new government. Stalin thus missed out on the great revolution he had dreamed of for years. Secretly, this must have hurt him. He returned to Petrograd and became the Bolshevik delegate to the Petrograd Soviet, a major workers' council. He also continued to edit the newspaper Pravda and finished third in the Bolshevik party elections. Stalin became a true political force to be reckoned with. In July, after a Bolshevik uprising, Lenin was pursued by the provisional government. Stalin helped him flee from Petrograd to Rasliv. Then, Stalin's great moment finally arrived. In Lenin's absence, he became the interim leader of the Bolsheviks. He was thus given the honor of leading the 6th Bolshevik Congress. The Georgian, who had fought for his ideals for decades, was finally able to realize all his dreams. It was at this moment, just before the Bolsheviks' Great October Revolution, that we leave Stalin as a provisional leader of the party. If you really want to know what happened next with Stalin and the Soviet Union, there are thousands of books that tell the story. Here's the short version. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. Stalin flattered Lenin, who was effectively the sole ruler of Russia. Lenin died, after which Stalin seized all power. Stalin became a dangerous dictator, increasingly mentally unstable, and ultimately murdered millions of people, either directly or indirectly. The end. Numerous psychologists have studied Stalin's youth to explain his dictatorship. Many agree that Stalin suffered from emotional deficiencies and lacked empathy. His father's violence, the economic uncertainties of his childhood, and his controlling mother certainly shaped his life, but we will never know how exactly. Stalin's childhood, of course, involved much more than secret book clubs, youth gangs, and absent fathers. Did you know that Stalin was a good poet? Or that he had far more lovers than his 2 wives? If you'd like to know more about Stalin's youth, be sure to read Simon Montefiere's book Young Stalin. Did you enjoy this podcast? Follow me, like this video, and leave a comment with new topics. Until next time, we need history.